Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. And we'll be spending the next couple of hours talking about ancient civilizations and wisdom that we can gain from ancient times that we can apply in our modern lives. And as always, Micheila is a trans channel, and I don't discuss any of the questions or the topics with her beforehand. She's a trans channel, so we'll be speaking directly to the guides, but just to keep her conscious mind from interfering with any of the information, I don't discuss it with her before the shows. So whenever you're ready, we can start.
All right. Okay.
Who are we speaking with today?
We are speaking with the Council of Light, as well as an assembly of many different interdimensional beings and councils who are prepared to provide answers to any questions necessary.
Is it the same as usual, or are there other councils that are present today?
We are calling upon the councils of different planets and star systems to assemble around us, knowing, of course, that there may be some historic events that need to be shared, but also various interpretations of universal law, as well as the workings of the cosmos.
Other planets, meaning planets within this solar system or just all over the place?
Within this universe.
Within this universe, okay. All right. So we've spent the last several conversations going in a particular direction and discussing primarily the Annunaki timeline, but this time I'm going to change directions and go and discuss an entirely different topic area in order to later bring that into the earlier conversations that we've had so we can add some more nuance to that. Along those lines, and so we'll later return to the Anunnaki story. But in many other conversations, this channel, not on Channel Revelation show, but has discussed dragons and the Dragon Collective and so on. And I'd like to focus in that particular area today, but bring a little bit more historical groundedness to the topic as well. And along those lines, first of all, is there any particular being or collective that is of a higher consciousness that has had either a physical incarnation or incarnation on Earth, of any kind, or maybe been present during the incarnation of other dragons in any Earth dimension? Is there someone else who could speak to that topic on a more personal level other than the councils that are present now?
Well, there are many who could speak to the topic, and the reason we are assembling multiple councils is ultimately, if we are to go into the history of dragons, we are looking at no different than your own DNA, an intergalactic connection, meaning that dragons are made of many different intergalactic and cosmic family histories bound together through the wisdom of a similar DNA construction. So while we can certainly present ourselves as necessary as we tailor suit these transmissions to what you are asking, we will draw upon the wisdom of many who are here.
Okay. Well, dragons, interestingly, seem to have a pretty dominant role in ancient mythology, and even to modern times we see dragon iconography around the world, in particular in European countries like in London, for example. We see a lot of iconography, but even the fact that it's used in various Hollywood films and such, the narrative seems to still be there, and in many ancient texts as well it's present. And what I'd like to kind of understand, first of all, is did dragons incarnate on Earth in any third to fifth dimensional experience, or is it just a collective that exists in a higher dimension but did not incarnate physically?
Well, it is both. If we are to uncover the entire history of dragon beings, we would have to go back to the very beginning of the Earth's evolutionary process to understand that the seeding of humanity required the interaction of beings from multiple dimensions and races that were lending their DNA and also excited to be a part of a new cosmic experience, as well as focused upon the expansion of the universe as a whole. So, what we consider dragon energy at the very beginning of this seeding process might be a bit different than those that are recognized in ancient times, because, like any historic account, there are going to be periods where these beings have evolved and hybridized on the earth, very much like we have spoken of in past transmissions about the Anunnaki coming through portals. And there may also be times when dragons have come in and manifested in the purest state of their light. Now, we have also referred to dragon gates or guardians, and many of the dragons that initially came to Earth were very interested in the inner workings of the underground passageways and tunnels and the various stargates and portals and how they operated. They also came to seed what is now known as elemental energy, much of which came from alternate planets and star systems, because we believe dragons to be more elemental in their expression. They are able to shapeshift, in other words, able to tap into the energy of the planet that they have come to experience and use it in some very intelligent or creative way.
Would dragons be considered reptilians? Is there a connection there, or are they an entirely different race?
There is a connection there, and again, we want to take you back to the very beginning of time, and this would take a bit of time to explain, because we're really tapping into a story that has continued on throughout history, yet is very focused on the reptilian race, much like what happened within the Anunnaki's history in terms of catastrophic events upon their home planet. The reptilians faced many. And coming to the earth at the very beginning of humanity's seeding, the reptilians that were in the highest and most loving focus lent some of the most incredible aspects of your human technology. They are very mind-driven beings, but it is an efficient way of manifesting for them. They do not have an emotional body, and they bypass what humans often slowly process as sensitivity. They have no need for this because they are shapeshifters moving through time and space and dimension very quickly. But you have to imagine that to have come to the earth to seed a race consecutive to a cataclysm taking place in their star system, things would have begun to shift or go awry. And we want to explain the process here so that you understand when a race is seeded, what is actually happening is the blending of Akashic energies from the DNA of all of the beings present puts together a format, a container, a structure, or a vehicle for new souls to arrive. So there is a very beneficial contribution on behalf of all of those who are present, but the energy that is being tapped into is actually collective in nature. So to give you an example, there were many Pleiadians who, at the beginning of the Earth's manifestation, took a great interest in understanding this new planet and had a strong desire, of course, to lead the way in the seeding process, not only of humans, but plants and animals and all of the lush nature that you find yourself surrounded by. When they came, they hybridized into a different form because the Earth's atmosphere and presentation is a bit different than that of the Pleiadian star system. But the goal is always to retain a connection to all that they have left behind, because that is where the greatest current of contribution actually comes from. It's no different right now than you being connected to the source field and using that source field as an implement through which you are manifesting in your life. Now, if a home star system is going through turmoil, or there's a great dimensional shift taking place simultaneous to beings landing on another planet, that energy is going to have an effect on how they hybridize and also continue their process of evolution, in other words. So when you connect the dragons to reptilians, what we wish to explain is that this was a modification that wasn't necessarily planned, but nonetheless happened. These dragon entities or reptilian energies were faced with a dire situation. They knew that the Earth was a new planet. It was very prosperous. There was already a contribution of their own DNA that could be tapped into, and many of them arrived in this form. Some of them took home in the inner Earth, which was a more comfortable vibration and dimension for them to acclimate to, while others hybridized differently on the surface of the Earth. So as you go through these periods of ancient history where you see the dragon iconography, you are often seeing the reptilians that took this form, we'll say, manifesting from the inner earth to the surface. Others are a more elemental representation and hybridization of those beings.
All right, let me make sure I understand so far. So the original seeding, the dragon energy or beings or collective were part of that seeding, and so we contain some of their genetics as well, which I assume is the more mentally focused aspects of us, the reptilian brain, as a matter of speaking. And so that was a very benevolent group of reptilians. And then there was this cataclysmic event that happened in their star system. And as a result of that, the reptilians that came over from that, which was at a much later time, were more malevolent. Is that correct?
Yes, we agree.
Okay. And is this a Draco star system or something else?
In the Draco star system, yes. And of course, there are many clusters and stars within that system to consider.
And what dimension were they in prior to their cataclysmic event that caused them to leave?
Well, there are some reptilians who came to the Earth at the very beginning of its seeding who had evolved into a 12th dimension. And this is why even today, there are reptilians who are known as some of the most benevolent and loving gods. They came not only to teach humanity about manifestation through the mind, but also techniques of healing. Now, when you come to the Earth, if you are in a 12th dimension, things are going to shift. It's not that you would not have access to that 12th dimensional energy, but you would find yourself vibrating into a dimension that is consecutive to all others. So certainly there was a lowering of dimension of the Earth through a variety of unintended and malevolent acts that began at this beginning period of time we are stating. At the same time, dragons or the Draco or the reptilians have taken on different shapes and forms and manifested in different dimensions throughout earthly history.
So are the kind of things that these ancient benevolent reptilians who were, or dragons, for example, who were part of the original seeding, you're saying they were teaching different things, or they were helping society advance in a positive way. Was this group what's responsible for the meditative teachings, for example? Because a lot of depictions of Buddha or Vishnu, for example, are shown with snakes surrounding them or sleeping on a bed with snakes. Is that representative of their mind-based teachings?
Well, we want to distinguish that they weren't always mind-based, even though the reptilian collective is a more mind-focused and driven collective. Keep in mind that those that came to teach meditative practices were not doing so necessarily through the mind, but teaching those on the planet how to transcend the linear nature of a physical mind. Because to have a mind is truly a brilliant expression of your hybrid nature. Unfortunately, the 12th dimensional, more benevolent reptilians that, yes, you certainly see depicted with ancient ascended masters, understood how vulnerable humanity could become to the lowering of its consciousness through the mind, or the swaying of the mind collectively to manifest more massive and earthly events. And that is why the snake imagery that you are referring to is not only considered a mere reflection of the presence of these beings, but perhaps the end result of the breath work and teaching, which had to do with raising the life force or the kundalini all the way to the crown, which in so doing activates what is known as a higher mind.
So when we see depictions in iconography and even ancient sculptures of beings such as Buddha or various Indian gods who are considered benevolent, when they are depicted with snakes, is that always representing this benevolent teaching or higher mind?
Well, we cannot say always, because it was a very auspicious time when these intergalactic beings chose to incarnate. Certainly, the dichotomy of light and darkness is also being represented in some of these symbolic renderings. At the same time, we also want to stress that the reptilians were somehow seen as light teachers or guardians of the various processes that perhaps the Buddha became known for. Many of you today are being, we'll say, mentored by cosmic families and intergalactic teachers who are bestowing upon you brand new modalities and technologies and teachings, and you are making them your own. So certainly we're seeing the interplay here between the higher dimensional reptilian collective and those that they were also training or somehow influencing in their ways.
Well, how can we distinguish between, because we have very benevolent reptilians, as we've talked about, and there's also malevolent reptilians as well. And in iconography and even in ancient mythology, we see representations of both, some that are very fierce and aggressive, and even there are various snake iconography around the world where the snakes look very aggressive and fierce, and then we also see them with Buddha side by side as well. Should we always assume that the appearance of it shows the orientation, meaning if it's a more fierce looking depiction, it might represent a malevolent being?
Well, not in every case, because there are also those who wanted to share the message or the appearance that those who were teaching positively aligned meditative practices were somehow evil. So it is dependent upon each image. And our advice is this: when you are looking back at ancient history and this type of symbology, you should always feel into how it has been created and for what purpose, because sometimes it is not as obvious as a visual representation. There are also embedded vibrations and frequencies within these symbolic renderings, very much like modern day channeling, for example, or what the original biblical accounts of Jesus were meant to uphold. Unfortunately, much of this has been degraded through time. So to simplify, we could say that based upon the fierce or more loving nature, this assumption could be made.
All right. So the dragon, the consciousness and collective came to Earth for the original seeding at a time when Draco was in the 12th dimension. When they came to Earth, though, were they still in the 12th dimension on Earth when the seeding happened? Was it a 12th dimensional seeding, or was it something else?
Well, at the original seeding, at the time when many of these beings arrived, Earth was and still is a 12th dimensional planet. It is just that the dimension that you have access to has more to do with the evolutionary process of the souls within the timeline you are focused than it does within the actual determination of a planet's dimension. In other words, we've spoken in previous transmissions about the very idea that within the inner earth, multiple dimensions exist. It is just that you are not perceiving those dimensions because they do not match your vibration. There's no magnetic draw or electromagnetic connection between what is happening in those dimensions and what's happening on the surface of Earth. Yet many of you understand, who are awakening to these various ideas, that it is easy, if you deliberately and diligently practice, to enter the 12th dimension and to receive wisdom, energy, or information and bring it into your physical experience. It is just sometimes that the experience itself cannot hold the energy that you have received. So we are certainly validating that this was a 12th dimensional experience at the very beginning of time, and it had to be, because the love-based frequency that is accessible in a unified 12th dimensional experience is somewhat necessary for a seeding process of this magnitude. We're not speaking exclusively of a physical seeding. We're speaking more of a vibrational anomaly, even at the level of what may be considered an immaculate conception or a tantric practice. Yet the reptilians continued to evolve, and we want to refer back to the cataclysm that happened in their star system. Those that came to seed were in a heart-based 12th dimensional frequency, but many more came simply because their star system and home had been somewhat degraded. And these are the ones that began to lower most in their frequency. It is very much like today on the planet. If human beings were faced with a catastrophic event, even if they existed in the 12th dimension, the conditions of that event and having to move through them may actually lower their dimension and vibration simply because of the experience they are having. And this is indeed what happened. So beyond the original seeders, who did continue on the earth and took more forms of light eventually, what actually began to happen was reptilians coming to the earth and hybridizing in lower dimensional frequencies.
All right. And so what you're saying about the 12th dimension still exists and we can access it, but we can't actually step into it. It's sort of like what we're doing here today, right? I'm conversing from the third to fifth dimensional space in this environment, but meanwhile discussing these topics with 12th dimensional consciousness.
Correct. You're always attuning yourself to the dimension that you need access to in order to continue to evolve. The problem is you are a collective, and we don't necessarily see this as a problem, yet on planet Earth, the collective is weighing you down in a sense. And this is why many are having dualistic experiences in their spiritual practice and focus, they are able to move between dimensions very efficiently. They're able to understand universal concepts and even teach them to others. Yet their lives are not necessarily reflecting a 12th dimensional reality. And to some degree, you must understand that Earth was created as a physical planet. So even though at the very beginning of time, the beings who came were 12th dimensional, they knew that once the seeding process started, the beings that had been seeded, new humans, were going to have to evolve in the likeness of the planet they chose. And that if they remained, some of their 12th dimensional structure would have to hybridize and adapt in order to remain on that planet. Now, it did not mean they did not hold and maintain access to their home star system. And this is a more complicated topic, and we don't want to veer off path, but we know that many of you are aware of various technologies, handheld and otherwise, that are seen in the depictions of ancient intergalactics. And these were elemental, very much like the dragon energy. But what they did was they allowed those that came in a 12th dimensional state, for example, to, regardless of the lowering of their frequency, still be able to capitalize upon the evolution that was taking place in their home star system. It's somewhat like a telepathic exchange at the DNA level that needed to be supported and, we'll say, modified to the Earth's frequency. So those who remained on planet Earth were in a constant technological negotiation with telepathic communication from their home systems, such that they could integrate within the DNA all that they had learned, and if they returned back, would find themselves at the perfect place and the perfect time to be a part of all that had happened while they were not present.
So you're referring to what by technologies that are handheld, you're referring to things like the handbags we see in many ancient depictions of the Annunaki, for example, or even the Ankh, which is in a lot of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Is that what you mean?
Yes, these are things that we are speaking of. More the handbag depictions than the Ankh, and we'll speak to that in a moment. These, if they were to be opened and exposed, could have changed realities in a moment. This is how powerful the energies that were brought together created a field, in other words. And that is why they are seen in such consolidation, because in the connection to them, an electromagnetic charge, or we'll say field again, was maintained, but it was intergalactic in nature. If you think, for example, of a pyramid, and we have spoken in past transmissions about the 369, creating an unbroken connection to the universe. These were almost like a mini pyramid that an individual soul had created that brought together both the frequencies of the Earth and the frequencies of their own star system to make this unbroken connection between their DNA and their collectives that they were not a part of presently.
And so these handbags enabled them, through the technology of what was in the bags, to maintain a connection to their star system, essentially, and maybe the dimension that they wanted to maintain while being on Earth, which was different.
Correct. They were very much like communication technologies, yet not in such a literal sense that communication was literally taking place as a cellular phone. This is more a DNA type of exchange that was happening. And it was important because those who were here were regarded as ancient masters of energy and teachers of light. And while certainly they had the ability to channel and had brought the memories of all that they had done on their own home planets to the Earth, all of that needed to be reconfigured in order to be shared here. And beyond that, the Earth was not always a very conducive atmosphere for those who had manifested from a different form. For example, some of these 12th dimensional beings manifested from pure light into a physical body, which is quite a radical change and different way of both manifesting as well as creating beyond the non-physical, and many were charged with this. Certainly we could tell stories, for example, about manifesting temples and technologies, which these ancient beings taught. But beyond this, their own bodies were considered to be much like the temple or the pyramids that are left behind. And they understood that they had to maintain clarity. There could be no distortions. If their bodies were going to transfer back into the light of which they came, they needed to keep pace with the evolutionary process that they had once started before they chose to come to a physical planet. It's somewhat like a skip in time that we have access to at a moment's notice. Our bodies are keeping up with dual timeline experiences through an individual soul's perspective. That is essentially what these technologies were capable of. Yet each of them slightly different and unique in their presentation based upon the cosmic location of which these beings came.
So it's sort of like maybe a dimensional bubble that was surrounding their bodies, let's say, as long as they kept these handbags nearby, that helped them maintain connection to their dimension, meanwhile walking in the physical earth.
Correct. Yes, that's a simplified way of putting it.
Okay. When their star system, Draco, degraded and the other reptilians who were more malevolent came to Earth later, did it drop in dimension before when that star system degraded?
This is almost always the case because any cataclysm will set off a chain of vibrational events that will lower the dimension of those that live upon it.
And what dimension did it drop to?
It has dropped to a third dimensional reality, even though very similarly to Earth, there are some that have shifted into more of a fifth dimensional timeline. Both exist simultaneously.
And it was third dimensional when the reptilians came to Earth later.
It is hard for us to depict exactly the dimension in which every reptilian came to Earth because we would have to cover an entire broad spectrum of time because it was not as if this was one single event.
So just so I can understand from a time perspective, did this event where the reptilians, after Draco had degraded, the more malevolent reptilians came to Earth? Was this prior to the Great Flood 13,000 years ago, or was it been since then?
Some, yes, prior to the Great Flood period. And again, we want to make a slight distinction about the word malevolent because those who came weren't necessarily setting their sights on destruction. They were focused on self-preservation. And because of that, malevolent acts began to ensue. But also, remember, the Earth as a different frequency than they were used to also changed them slightly. Where operating through the mind without the benefit of an emotional body and a structure that blended both aspects led them to manifestations that were not in humanity's best interest.
All right, so they came to Earth, and when they came to Earth, I'm talking about the group that came after the Draco degraded to a lower dimension. Did they enter the Earth in the third dimension then, or was it a different one?
You're asking if the Earth existed in the third dimension upon their entry?
Well, obviously, all the dimensions still exist, right? My question is, what dimension did they enter into when they came to Earth?
Well, if we are to look across the board and make a determination, because we couldn't say in every single case that every single reptilian came into a third dimensional form, the third dimension was primary for them upon their hybridization. And this is why reptilians, very much like yourselves, even though they have evolved all the way through the 12th dimension and are able to shape shift, for example, are more physical in their presentation. So coming to a planet like Earth, especially at a period of time in which they were facing a cataclysm, brought the majority of them in a more third dimensional state.
All right, and so they came to Earth in a third dimensional state, and now, and this we've discussed in previous conversations how there are multiple timelines that we've discussed. For example, Atlantis was on the 9th dimension on Earth. The Anunnaki were 5th dimension on Earth, and then as of 13,000 years ago, it descended down to 3rd dimension, where we've been since then. So the reptilians you're talking about came into a 3rd dimension prior to 13,000 years ago. Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, we agree.
Okay. So in that case, is it fair to say that they were existing in an entirely different reality than the Anunnaki or the Atlanteans? Or were they, because the 3rd and the 5th dimension can interact, were they in a similar interacting with the Anunnaki?
Well, we don't want to use the word interaction because that would assume that there was some physical interplay between these beings. And of course, remember, we cannot exclude every single timeline that there has ever been on planet Earth, because what you are saying is true. The 3rd and the 5th dimensions are so closely connected that they almost always coincide. Third dimensional collectives or realities are attempting to evolve, and because they are moving into multidimensionality, and the 5th dimension is the first step for that. But for the most part, you are looking at a distinguishing factor here between those that were Anunnaki and those that were considered reptilian.
All right, but did they coexist on Earth in the same time?
Yes, of course they did.
They
Yes.
just didn't know about each other then.
Well,
in some
knowing
cases.
is something that we don't necessarily look at in a physical sense, because remember, these were very evolved intergalactic beings, many of them using technologies and able to teleport themselves back to their home star system, where they would have certainly known about the evolutionary process of the Earth and beings that had come to be a part of it, even if they did not necessarily cross paths.
So in some cases, did the Anunnaki, being that they were in the 3rd dimension, the reptilians were in the 3rd dimension, Anunnaki were in the 5th, in some instances, did they interact?
Yes, absolutely. And that is the case for any timeline shift or split on any planet. It is very similar to what is happening today, although you wouldn't tend to interact with those who are not of the same frequency level or consciousness. It is inevitable that there are going to be times when you will, and that is because the universe dictates it to be so. It is the only way that evolution can take place.
So it's sort of like in our previous conversations about if you're walking down the street and you're operating in 5th dimension and you're walking next to someone who's in the 3rd dimension, you may not interact with them because you have really nothing to say to each other because you're existing in very different realities, even though you're walking side by side. Was this similar to what was happening?
It is, and we would also add that there were very different distinguishing intentions for being on the Earth, as well as what was focused upon as survival, where the common thread may have been working through human DNA for those who are more malevolently focused. The Anunnaki were more highly technological in their process as opposed to the reptilians, who, while have created technology, are more closely connected to the elemental energies of any physical structure. And even, as you had mentioned previously, working with breath.
And were these interactions, considering, if I'm understanding correctly, the Anunnaki being in a fifth dimension primarily and the reptilians being in a third, I would think that the Anunnaki would be a higher level of consciousness than the third. Is that correct?
Consciousness, meaning the access to vibration and energy, yes. Keep in mind the big difference here that we want to point out is the reptilians are designed to be very physically and mentally focused. So that does not preclude a race from evolving in consciousness, yet they also found themselves on a planet that may not have been exactly conducive to their ability to do what many of the Anunnaki had been focused on for a very long time, which was using the wisdom and the tools at their disposal that they had learned from their home star system and putting them into application here.
So are these handbags that, if we were to, are any of them still here, or did they take them with them?
The handbags were not necessary to be taken from the Earth back to any home planet or star system, for they would not have been needed. Many of them were destroyed, or because they were made of organic materials, may have decomposed over time, while others are certainly able to be unearthed and we believe will be in order to be better understood.
And if we were to open these today, what would we find? Some sort of elements, or what would the technology look like? Obviously not like circuit boards and things we know of as technology today, I assume.
Very different in their presentation. And of course, we have to explain that the power of the electromagnetic field that they created may have diminished simply because the way they were constructed was tailor suited to the environment and the dimension that they lived in then, which is quite different from the timeline that you are on now. If you were to open the handbags, of course, they might all look a bit different in their presentation. Yet, one of the common components that you may find is a coil. Using the different elemental properties focused around a center coil in order to create a resonance. Also, much of what you see in the crop circles that originate from light ships, these various images may have been carved into stone, also using elements natural to earth, such as gold, for example, or using a liquid substance like water or plasma. These were all combined in order to make a valid connection to the star systems in which these beings came. Now, we've talked about these substances native to Earth, but remember, these beings were also imbuing their own genetic imprint upon these technologies. It was very important because what they knew was the crystalline vibration of their DNA was akin to the various crystals that could be found within the inner earth. When they brought the two together, meaning holding them in close proximity to the body, there would be an undeniable and undetectable feeling or resonance, much like the creation of a mandala inside of a temple. This is how they were tuned, in other words, very much like a modern day instrument. When an instrument is tuned, the player can almost feel or sense that the instrument it knows so well has become perfected for its use. These technologies were very much the same in that they had to be tuned to the individual who was using them, and sometimes even upgraded at times to match the changing vibration of the earth as well as the cosmos.
Was copper used in any way in these devices? Because in some ancient mythology, snakes or reptilian beings are associated with copper.
Copper was the foundation of the coil that we are speaking of. And yes, it certainly was present, although we would say the copper that many of you are using today, or even ingesting, for example, in the body, may have slightly shifted in its elemental property beyond what those who were using it in historic timelines had access to.
Beyond meaning better in some way, or what do you mean by beyond?
Well, the elements of earth are always shifting themselves to meet the humans that are using them. And it is a little known fact that elements are somewhat conscious. So even gold, silver, copper, various crystals, the element of water, it is adapting itself to meet the vibration of the human collective. And this is why we stress always that the elements of the body are so telepathically intermeshed with those of the earth that if you were aware of this, you could restore and heal your bodies or the earth in very short periods of time. The ancestors knew this very well, and it is why many of the ancient healers were focused on bodily elements and ensuring that they become restored and aligned, because it is your connection to your home planet. It is how you find balance and equilibrium as an individual being in a physical body.
Just hypothetically, if we were to find one of these bags today, are they in any way beneficial to human beings who are incarnated now, or is this a technology that really doesn't serve a purpose now?
Only from the perspective of research, we believe, as there are many on the planet today who are creating similar forms of technology, not for the purpose of the handbags necessarily, but in order to hold humans in connection to cosmic energy, or to increase the flow of what we call the divine through the physical body and into the earth. And we think that the design of these technologies from a purely focus of study might be helpful in these endeavors.
All right. So during the Anunnaki time period, we also had reptilians in the third dimension. And I suppose just like there are third dimensional humans walking the earth today who are perfectly nice people and very happy people, you also have very malevolent third dimensional human beings walking the earth today. I suppose this is very similar with the reptilians. They might have been both as well, right?
You must keep in mind that the reptilians who have arrived on the earth from the beginning of time have hybridized in many different forms. Some of them a very physical presentation, and others a more non-physical presentation. Some have become more merged with human life forms, and others choosing a more reptilian presentation.
Right, but my question is, just like we have human beings today in the third dimension, maybe they don't perceive higher dimensional concepts like we're discussing today, but they may be having perfectly happy, peaceful, loving lives and be nice people, versus we also have a lot of third dimensional human beings running around the earth today who are not very nice people, who are doing very evil things. Would this be also true of the reptilians who are in the third dimension?
Well, it depends upon the timeline that you are focused in and asking us about. If we were to answer this question based on present moment reality, we would have to explain that the reptilians who are here, both within the inner earth and who have manifested on the surface, are malevolently focused for the most part because they are not doing well here. There things about the earth that they need to change in order to continue their evolutionary process or to strengthen themselves vibrationally. And because of this, they are acting in ways through the mind with no access to an emotional body or empathy that would put them in a category of more malevolent in their focus. Yet, if we were to go back to the entry of many of these reptilians in ancient history and in even at the very beginning of time, we would say that what you are assuming is the case. There were many who were here in a more benevolent focus and others who came with a more malevolent one.
Referring to the ones you said that are on Earth today or in the Earth, so is that why, and I think we've discussed this in the past, why people like various world leaders are spraying chemtrails or wanting to darken the sun? This is to make the Earth more beneficial or conducive to reptilian life. Is that correct?
This is correct. The reptilians who are here are attempting to modify the earth to their liking, and it is through density that they thrive, which we know is a difficult concept to accept because you have learned that density is actually prohibitive to your ability to manifest to your desires and to your liking. We are not necessarily speaking about emotional density here. We are speaking about the density of physicality or a very dense material reality because they are shapeshifters and they are instantaneous manifestors. And what they want is to have a physical connection to that intention. And in order to do that, they have to move aside all of the interference or the things that might stand in the way of the clarity of what they wish to bring to fruition. For example, they are here as a part of a collective no less important than every human being or living being on the planet. The darkening of the sun or the dimming of the sun is an important consideration in this because they do not do well with the polarity or the plasmic energy of the solar injections that you reap the rewards from. They are very different in their structure, and what they are going for is to create a reality that does not have the very high electromagnetic field that many of you operate through in coherence. To break that apart allows them to have more power because while they are physically focused and also do very well within a more dense environment, remember, they are very mind-driven beings and they bypass many of the parts of your human structure that benefits from all of these things. What the polarity of the sun might do to a reptilian who's arrived on the planet today is actually activate a sense of empathy or emotion within them. And this is something that would slow them down. It's actually something that they are not used to dealing with. So where a human being might become ill or sick in the physical body and not have the energy to create, this is actually what happens to a reptilian who has taken a more physical presentation on this physical planet. They would be very slowed in their ability to manifest and to create.
In many very ancient buildings or structures in India, for example, there are small holes that go underneath the buildings, and the mythology or the locals in that area have stories of the Naga who actually lived and came out of these holes in ancient times to teach the people who were there at the time, and that those holes were, for them essentially, because they're not something that human beings can crawl into. And that underneath these buildings there is a vast network of caves and tunnels that the Naga lived in. Is that because of the sun they needed to live underneath the earth?
Yes, if they were to remain on the surface of the earth for an elongated period, what they were able to teach and accomplish as physical beings would have been diminished greatly. And many of them who came bore into the earth and created these caves and communities that are now known as their living dwellings. They were not there previously. So the inner earth has become a more comfortable resonance for many of these beings. Some of them were very enlightened, but as they remained in these areas and attempted to sustain themselves, have become weakened in their ability to transmit high vibrational teachings and methodology.
And so they're living in the inner earth because of solar radiation, but also is that also because being inside the earth itself is a higher density environment?
It is a far more dense environment. And again, we don't want to mix up the terminology here. We know that many define density in very linear terms. When we're speaking of density, we want you to think about dimension. For example, many would not consider what exists in the first or the second dimension because you don't exist there today. But we think of the first dimension as the density of form, like material rock, for example. While a rock can be highly conscious, it does not need necessarily light to evolve because it is here to experience its reality through the density of thick form. And very much like that, the reptilians prefer a more dense type of environment, not necessarily on their home planets, but here on Earth, because the surface is far different than the orientation of their structures.
So is it adverse for them that the collective consciousness of humanity is moving from third to fifth? Is that a problem for them?
The only reason it is a problem is that you are beginning to merge your structures, your inner technology to work as one. And so we want to explain. We keep going back to the idea that the human mind was the contribution of the reptilian collective. And it is a beautiful organism. It is something that they have learned to use and have mastered through time. But for a human being to only manifest through the mind or to live and create through the mind is a limitation of its evolutionary path. So to move truly into the fifth dimension, you have to be able to reconnect the mind to the other aspects of your physicality and your energetic structure, whether that be the emotional body, for example, or the spiritual body. Many would refer to this as the divine feminine or reactivating the feminine within form. It is not to say that the reptilians do not understand or have learned to work with masculine and feminine balance, but remember, they do not use the benefit of an emotional body. So the more that humans adapt to an emotional body, the more that they begin to utilize it in concert with the mind, the more they are ascending into the fifth dimension. Now, it is assumed that the fifth dimension is the same for everyone, but we must open the playing field here to other realities where fifth dimension, because it's multidimensional, can be something completely different for a race beyond the earth. So perhaps what we're alluding to here is that the ascension into the fifth dimension that humans are walking is truly not conducive to reptilians going that direction. It's why they are holding on so desperately to the third dimension, because they have hybridized and adjusted to it so comfortably that any change there is going to affect them dramatically.
So when we're talking about density, does that also reflect on the current state of being of the collective consciousness of human beings? For example, in the recent years, it seems like there's a lot more suffering and hardship on the planet. Does that also contribute to greater density, which benefits the reptilians, or are we talking about an entirely different kind of density?
Well, it does, and this is why. The energy that you're speaking of, it is non-physical. And certainly the reptilians are both physical and non-physical, just like you are. Yet their non-physicality works a bit differently than what you have evolved to become. In other words, when you are existing in a reality where there is a great deal of suffering, you're not tuned in to your creative potential. Something else is able to siphon your life force for the benefit of their endeavors. And that is why there is so much suffering created in the third dimension. It somewhat creates a dormancy within a human's ability to create at its fullest potential. But the energy of that creation is always present. So either we are using it to our benefit, or it is going elsewhere to be used by those who may not have our benefit in mind. And that is the true current reptilian human anomaly we believe that you're existing within, is that the more energetic density or emotional suffering that is placed upon a collective, the more energy that becomes available for those who are creating the suffering.
So the last few years in particular, then, is it fair to say that the reptilians have been thriving as a result of more suffering on the planet?
Not necessarily. We cannot confirm that. Remember, there is a desperate attempt upon on the behalf of those who are here, who are attempting to reinstate their DNA and thrive as a primary race, while at the same time remembering that this is coming from a place of weakness. So those who are in power are assumed to have all of the control and are thriving, when in fact, what we observe is that the only reason they're creating so much discordance is because they are in fear. They are in fear of losing that power. They are in fear that their genetic template will somehow be eroded and not be able to become restored. Or in some circumstances, they will not have the accumulation of energy or density that they need to continue to thrive. And this, we believe, is the analogy across the board of many of the discordant timelines that you are attempting to fight up against at the moment.
Going back to India, I mentioned the Naga in India, and it's a very prominent part of their culture and their ancient stories and mythologies. Are these Nagas essentially the same as these third dimensional reptilians that we were speaking of?
We wouldn't say the same. Remember, they are genetically tied. They come from the same cosmic family, but may have evolved completely differently on the earth than those that we speak of today. Just like human beings who have evolved as different races and through different levels of consciousness, the massive number of reptilians who have come to Earth have also done the same. And this is why in certain geographic regions or in ancient civilizations, you will see them depicted differently. Some are acting out of their weakness and attempting to gain power, and others are here trying to create a life that is somehow meaningful and purposeful in sharing what they know with a race that is completely different from them.
So we have many mythologies and even iconography of reptilians, and they look different in different areas. Some appear to be more snake-like, some appear to be more dragon-like. Were both of those forms existing in on Earth throughout its history, or was it one in particular?
Well, both of those forms and many forms in between. Yet we think the iconography that you're speaking of is so important to consider. Because if we go back to even biblical periods where the story of Adam and Eve is very well known, the snake iconography can be seen as the dualistic dark versus light, where there could have been a choice to follow the darkness or to, within the self, raise the life force to highest potential. And sometimes when you are seeing the snake in various ancient settings, it is merely a symbol of this choice, or perhaps what a master is attempting to teach through a transmission of energy or light. Certainly in other circumstances, it is a linear and literal depiction of how these beings presented themselves. Yet we cannot deny, very much like what is happening today, those that may have seen the snake-like reptilians, even including the Naga, may have been having a more astral interpretation of them, meaning these weren't literal physical encounters. These were beings who were presenting themselves to humans in meditative state or in dream state, for example. And these are the images that are left behind. The same goes for the dragon symbology. We have seen dragon energy manifest on the earth from many different cosmic lineages. It is not just reptilian in its presentation, and you must always keep this in mind, because dragons have taken on not only many physical forms, but very much like what we have explained about the Naga, have shown themselves energetically and been interpreted through even communal meditative experiences. Those who have been using plant medicines, for example, and have taken tours through the inner earth have intersected with many of these dragons that do exist there and remain there in a form of light or even higher vibration, but are translated through the perception of consciousness.
Some of the depictions of dragons, or even in ancient mythology or even modern Hollywood films, for example, show not really a snake-like being, but rather a being that looks more dinosaur-like with four legs, two or more wings. Did they ever take a physical form like that?
Oh, they most certainly have in several different timeline realities. And we see these as reptilian hybrids who have come to the planet and took a physical presentation or manifestation.
Is there any relationship between that particular type of dragon and what we know of as dinosaurs, or is it a totally different race of beings?
There is some crossover here genetically, certainly, because any time that a race evolves on a physical planet, it is going to spawn new manifestations of itself in slightly different forms.
I'm not a paleontologist, but from your perspective, I assume dinosaurs actually did exist at some point, at least at what we know of them as these very large reptilian type of beings.
Yes, yeah, we agree.
And were these reptilian beings, who scientists consider as being a very primitive race of animals, were they intelligent in the way that you're describing other reptilians being of a higher mind?
Well, we see a very important distinction here between various breeds of what is now known as dinosaur and those who had wings. And that's the important consideration, because those that had wings were more intergalactic in their focus, meaning they were more representative of what is now known as reptilian consciousness. Where those on the ground, and you've used the word animal, for example, it took more of a dense form, not necessarily highly conscious, but interested in becoming oriented to a physical earth and evolving in close proximity to that earth. Again, it's very much like the stories of ancient giants. And we will go back to some of the analogies that we have used before. When any being comes through a portal, all of the information that it has gained throughout its past lifetimes must translate into material form because it is coming onto a material planet. This can be seen even in the elongated skulls of some of the intergalactic hybrids of various ancient periods, where the hybridization took a very physical type of formation, either in the height or the weight or the presentation of those beings, or somehow manifesting as light.
Now, since the Anunnaki coexisted with some of the reptilians, and some did have interaction, was that interaction more benevolent, or meaning did they get along, or were they aggressive toward each other?
Both, we believe, but we lean more towards the collaboration in this sense, because even though both had experienced very similar cataclysmic origins prior to coming to Earth, they found themselves in the situation to share the knowledge that they had in order to preserve their genetics. So there are some timelines that literally cross where we see reptilian and Anunnaki beings, we'll say, co-conspiring in the access of human DNA, or even in the creation of more dense realities on the Earth. You see, while the reptilians require a more dense environment in order to thrive, this isn't necessarily a requirement or a prerequisite for the Anunnaki. Yet, in order to accomplish their goals, very similar outcomes were beneficial. To blend the more technological insights and knowledge of the Anunnaki with the non-physical understandings of energy has resulted in some of the experiences that you are still having today.
Now, in some ancient mythology, it refers to, in some respects anyway, in my interpretation of it, that there were reptilian beings who were fighting or warring with the Anunnaki. Was that true?
There have been wars between the reptilians and the Anunnaki, and this, in a very similar sense, has been over energy and access to DNA, because even though there are periods of time where they are able, or they were able to contribute to each other in creating similar outcomes, each of them were focused on interacting with human DNA in a different way, in other words. So even the elemental connection is something that we must consider. If the reptilians, the inner earth beings, or even the dragons, for example, are elemental beings, and we have a collective like the Anunnaki who are interested in harvesting and disturbing the elements of earth, eventually we are going to see some clash in terms of their ability to work together.
It seems to me that in ancient times, there were gods both on the Anunnaki side, so Anunnaki gods that were worshipped by human beings, and there were also reptilian gods who were worshipped by human beings, and they had very different approaches in the manner that it seems like their teachings or their desire to be worshipped went in opposition with each other, meaning the Anunnaki gods wanted to be worshipped primarily, and the reptilian gods wanted to be worshipped primarily, and they're constantly trying to sway human beings to one side or another. Was that true?
Well, it is true, and this is self-preservation is what you are seeing here, because if each collective is attempting to preserve their own DNA. And somehow through human beings siphon the energy to be able to do that, you are going to see gods appear in order to take precedence over each other.
Another commonality I found is that both groups, both types of gods, also had human blood sacrifices. Was that because of you're talking about the DNA and the energy, is that more easily drawn from human blood?
Well, it is not the physicality of the sacrifice that is the most important consideration. When these sacrifices were done, it was a symbolic offering of energy, and it was the act itself through which the energy was siphoned. So the blood is merely, we'll say, a consequence of a more symbolic type of ceremonial endeavor that those who engaged in these acts had come to understand.
Meaning, if you are giving as a human being, a blood sacrifice or even a human sacrifice, it's showing a greater level of commitment of your energy to that particular god.
Well, it is showing a greater level of commitment of energy, most certainly, while at the same time offering the energy at its highest point. We're not talking about vibrationally here. When a human sacrifice is made, the level of fear and sorrow within the humans who are doing it, even though they believe they are appeasing their gods, is tangible. And this is what the gods themselves actually thrived upon.
Getting back to the dragon beings who appear in our mythology, 4 legs, wings, and so on, did that particular race of dragons also physically interact with human beings at that time?
Yes, and we see these interactions, even though some physical, being more energetic in nature.
So where did the stories and the iconography come from? How did human beings depict them if it wasn't a physical interaction?
It is much like what we have explained about traveling into the inner earth. Many learned that to interact with higher dimensional beings that were present upon their planet, they would have to breathe in a certain way or together chant and tone until they found themselves in a different reality. And many would come back with very vivid depictions, as well as translations of energy and information that was exchanged during these encounters. It does not mean, however, that physical encounters did not occur. However, it's far more rare, we believe, throughout history where dragons would have exposed themselves so vulnerably in a physical form to humans on the surface of the earth. Mostly because the dragons that are more benevolent, and we're not necessarily talking about the reptilians only here, they were so kind and compassionate. Many of them who came understood the inner earth far better than the surface. They were here to protect precious passageways, tunnels, underground waterways, areas geographically where elements coincided. And to have created fear within a human would have been of detriment to their personal purpose, because any fear on the surface of the earth is bound to have a strong interaction with anything that lies below it. We have spoken in this transmission about the elements within the body having an electromagnetic connection to all elements on earth. The dragons of history know this very well. In fact, they came to be teachers of it.
How do you explain then the phenomenon that is depicted in a lot of ancient mythology of dragons who are breathing fire and setting villages on fire where human beings lived and such? Was that a multidimensional etheric experience, or did it physically occur?
Well, as we mentioned, some of these encounters were indeed physical. The ones you are speaking of are more reptilian, we would say, in their presentation than the dragons we are speaking of.
More reptilian meaning they appeared more like snakes, or reptilian meaning a humanoid reptilian?
What you are saying about humanoid is what we agree with. We call it a hybrid, certainly. And the dragon presentation, it was something that, even though depicted in a very fearful way, may have looked a bit different in the times that those experienced it, meaning they weren't necessarily all dragon-like or bird-like in their manifestation. Some of them more human and very much like the hybrids that are seen as gods or demigods. These beings are very similar.
Well, in China, they have mythology about ancient dragons, which are still part of huge part of their culture. And their dragons appear more like snakes with small legs, and they're said to have breathed fire. So, was this an actual physical reptilian being that existed?
Well, in some circumstances, yes, but we do want to clarify the idea of breathing fire and translate it more as alchemy, meaning many of these beings, whether they be more reptilian in presentation or hybrid, understood how to shapeshift and manipulate form, much like the creation of a temple or a pyramid, where light ships may have been called in and templates were used to transform rock and granite into perfect symmetry. These beings had the ability to do the same. And while the fire may be seen as very linear and a physical depiction of what they were able to do, what their breath was capable of was moving mountains, changing physical form, and even destroying things at will if they believed it necessary.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is it wasn't necessarily a physical fire as we would see fire today, but essentially with their breath, sort of like a pranic fire in a manner of speaking. So they had the ability to transform matter or environments, even destroy things with that energy.
Yes, exactly.
So when we're hearing of this mythological idea of fire-breathing dragons, we're actually referring to the chi or the prana then.
Mystical beings with an ability to channel energy at very high rates and direct and use it at will.
Okay. And this is something exclusive to dragons, or is this something human beings could also do with prana?
Well, it is certainly not exclusive to dragons. It is something that all beings throughout the universe are capable of doing, although it is dependent upon the form that they take and the way that they channel the energies. So alchemy is your God-given birthright, and those in ancient civilizations practiced in order to be able to teleport themselves or to move objects with the mind or to collaborate on a massive scale with light beings and intergalactic ships when they wanted to create technology. These things are still possible today, even though you exist in a timeline where it does seem impossible. It is only because you are bound and confined by the presence of the third dimension that still exists on your planet.
So when we hear about these stories of dragons or even more snake-like dragons from ancient times that could destroy an entire town or village with fire, they were powerful enough to do that? One being could do that?
One being was capable of interacting with an entire community or village dependent upon their level of evolution. And each being was certainly different in that level of evolution. And intention also comes into this because while certainly many of these dragons may have been focused on malevolent acts, it was codependent upon the individuals that were being acted upon. This is not something that is easy for us to relay, but it still holds true today that you are co-conspiring and a participant within every collective event. Nothing can be done upon you unless you are somehow agreeing to it or giving permission to it. But what has happened through time is that permission has been given very unconsciously. And we might say that is a connection between the reptilians and the dense environment that they so desire, is they are attempting to put humans in such a fog or a cloud of density that they are receiving agreement subconsciously to do the things that they set out to do.
So in ancient times, just by the worship of the human beings of these reptilian gods, as an example, they were contributing the energy that these dragons or reptilian gods were then using to control them or even destroy an entire city. If the humans didn't cooperate with that energy exchange, would it have been possible for them to have the power to do that?
We believe it would have been much harder to do that. Not to say that these beings did not have the power of alchemy and elemental fire within them, but it is a physical reality in which the energy of every soul is a contribution. And that means the awakening of consciousness is able to slow, stall, or weaken the energetic acts of anything that is attempting to destroy it.
Now, there's a lot of reptilian or dragon kind of mythology in Mexico, South America, for example, with the Mayans, with Kukulkhan, who is depicted as a feathered serpent, some sort of a fiery reptilian with feathers, which appears to be a dragon, at least from the descriptions we see in mythology. Was this a dragon of some sort?
Well, it is not unusual to see some of the ancient native cultures adapting to the teachings of these various gods or reptilians, because remember, they were elemental beings and the natives were living so close in connection to nature and the earth that they were attempting to understand it better. Some of these tribes were gaining very beneficial information, for example, about how to alchemize through collective and tribal ceremony a shift in the energies. And this is where the very idea of a rain dance comes in. Others were perhaps led astray in their abilities and understanding of their own power, where they may have adopted more to the idea of a god or a single power that lied beyond them.
Okay, speaking specifically of Kukulkhan as an example, was this, so where you're saying an elemental being, so did he incarnate in physical form with the human beings of that time, or was this simply an astral or etheric experience that they were having?
He was a shapeshifter. So at times he would appear as if in physical form, while also able to transcend that form into light.
And was Kukulkhan a benevolent reptilian being or malevolent?
Well, there were many benefits that this being offered the Mayan tribes, and much of this is seen in what we would call their technologies, which also are known as various structures that were built close to the earth and with earthly elements. At the same time, there was an exchange of power that was going on, where there was some praying to this god and lowering of frequency of those on the earth. So very much like today, some of you are following within your own lives those who appear as gods or teachers. And it isn't necessarily that they are giving you information that is wrong or bad, but when it is given, it is accepted as law. And in so doing limits a soul's ability to be able to retrieve their own information and achieve their own level of mastery and to assume these powers within themselves. So we might say the Mayan culture was very much like that, in that they were reaping the benefits of a great teacher. And some of those benefits came to fruition and have been left behind, seen and used by others. Well, at the same time, this culture, civilization, could have assumed a higher level of consciousness. They could have evolved far greater if not giving their power up to a single being.
And the pyramids that were built in South America, Mexico, that general area, have a similar structure to Egyptian pyramids, but definitely different. Were these built by these reptilian beings such as Kukulkhan, or were these also constructed by Thoth, as we discussed before he built pyramids around the world?
The architecture or the schematic of these were created by the god that you speak of. Yet those that were present on the earth as Mayans physically contributed to the construction of these pyramids. And there was a great consideration for the underground chambers, waterways, and tunnels that we've been alluding to throughout this channeling. Connecting very specific power points to areas of these structures such that individuals could enter and be transformed. Now, Thoth, as an intergalactic being, also had input into some of these structures. Yet, what you're seeing in Egypt and how those came together are very completely different in their construction. And this has more to do, again, with the dimension in which these civilizations existed in, as well as the presence of certain cosmic families and light beings who were assisting. Think of the Mexican or even the Mayan pyramids, for example, as being more earthly in their construction. Not that the construction was not seen through astral vision or contemplated through the architecture of a higher dimensional being, but truly put into place through the efforts and even sometimes the magic of those who were practicing in spiritual ways. Where in Egypt, the light ships truly took a more lead role in the construction of many of these sites.
Okay, so the similarity, if I'm understanding correctly, between the two different sites, Egypt and South America, is that they both, they didn't physically create them in the sense that they, as scientists or archaeologists or people believe today, is that slave labor was used to hand chisel these blocks of stone and carry them up a ramp to put them in place. So that was not how it was done in either case. Well, based on what you're saying that they were created vibrationally, but the difference is that in Egypt they used light ships. In South America or the Mayan civilization, they used some sort of vibrational frequency energy, the gods themselves.
Even sound technology, we might say.
Sound technology generated from these reptilian beings, or technology of some sort?
Actual physical technology. Here is the similarity, and perhaps this will be helpful. Well, those who consider that each stone was cut and placed have a limitation in terms of the timeline and capability. We have to look at the various materials that were being used. These materials were electromagnetic and vibrational in their quality. And because of this, those who are very adept at alchemizing material were able to use forms of light, for example, injections of plasma or sound to vibrate through templates a certain form and to let all of the rest of the material that was not necessarily needed fall away. And this is why the area around these pyramids and even beneath is so magical and still sustains a certain field or quality, because it is not just the structure itself that is important, but all of the materials that were touched by the sound or the light that still hold the energy. And that's why it matters not whether a pyramid is destructed or whether it still stands. The alchemy and the energy that was put into it will forever remain. And in regards to master architects like Thoth, for example, you must keep in mind that pyramids, all pyramids on planet Earth, are a collective or a family. They are designed to be interconnected, both beneath the earth through the ley lines, as well as within their orientation to the cosmos. This was a very purposeful design in order to activate important portals or areas for healing, for example, or even entry or runways for various light ships or plasma ships to arrive. So there is a commonality and a symmetry to all of these various manifestations that you call pyramids, while each of them were architected at the time slightly differently.
So even though Thoth wasn't involved in the construction directly of the South American pyramids, they all essentially serve the same purpose. The Egyptian and South American, other ones around the world, are all part of the same grid then?
They each have a unique individual purpose that is slightly different than another, yet together as one, they are creating and holding a field. So it is, yes, true what you are saying, that they are all meant to be connected and are strategically located in specific areas to benefit the whole of the earth, while at the same time taking on very unique characteristics that apply to what the people of those times purposely required, or what masters like Thoth understood would be needed in the future.
Now, you said, if I remember correctly, that Kukulkhan was a benevolent god, correct?
Yes, for the most part.
Okay. And so let me explore that idea a little further. When you say for the most part, a lot of ancient reptilian gods appear to have been a little bit of both. And this is also true for the Anunnaki, of course, but in the sense that these were gods who wanted to be worshipped. They wanted people to follow them, and they also fought wars, and they also destroyed and villages and people and things like that. So when people did not, or human beings rather, did not worship them or give them their energy, they often became violent. So is that what you mean by for the most part?
It is what we are alluding to, yet each individual god being different in its intention. For example, they came to teach others in the ways of what they knew because they were attempting to actually modify the earth to their liking. So there was a give and a take, and certainly an exchange of energy that was going on that may have been perceived as benevolent by those receiving it. For example, many of the ancient tribes that we have spoken about may have benefited greatly from some of the teachings that were bestowed upon them by these beings, while at the same time giving up the balance of their own power in order to receive them. And yes, certainly there were some who were very angry gods that, when not receiving what was necessary to sustain them, may have created fear in order to continue to receive what was necessary to empower them. And this is, again, ultimately because they were weakened as they came here as reptilians. And that is always going to be at the core and foundation of these various stories. Even though these gods may be seen in all of their glory and in all of their power throughout history, ultimately, the underlying factor was the fear that their genome would not continue on, or somehow they would be diminished in their structure such that they could not thrive on the physical earth. So the constant receival or generation of life force and power has been the common thread or theme that has been very important to these reptilians. And when it is not present, creates a different form of consciousness within the being itself.
Now, in more current times, more modern times, the Aztecs actually took over much of the pyramids and the land that was left behind by the Mayans. What happened to the Mayans and that caused the Aztecs to take over that area?
Many of the Mayans, while they were somewhat hybrid themselves, were led astray from their origins and their ancestry, meaning they were leading false gods who were very unlike themselves and attempting to become something that they were not. It's similar to today in your modern day society, where the ego is led astray within a human to believe that they are something they are not. And then they begin acting out of that ego and not living the fullness of their organic truth or divine plan. Ultimately, it may not lead to their physical demise, but if an entire collective or family is focused on in this way, ultimately generations beyond it will not live or thrive. And that is what happened. Remember, genetic manipulation was very much alive in the past, even though it took different forms than it does today, meaning those in power were attempting to remain in power by wiping out the ones who had awakened or had somehow seen through the illusion that they must pray to a god that was no greater in power than themselves. So the Mayan collective, it did not continue on simply because those that were procreating in that civilization had been led astray to believe that that procreation was not coming from the purest of place. In addition to this, there was a small cataclysm within this collective, more having to do with inner earth frequencies than something coming from off planet. We've talked about genetic manipulation in many different formats, especially in today's world, as your food supply, for example, has been injected with things that are not healthy for you. This has taken place in civilizations like the Mayans in frequency-based forms. So combination, we'll say, of many things that led to the Mayan demise.
And so the Aztecs evolved out of the Mayans, or was it an entirely different race that later entered that area and took over that area?
We see the Aztecs as being original nomads, not necessarily genetically related to the Mayans, although you must consider that in close proximity geographically, there would be some crossover here.
Were the Mayans Caucasian, or were they similar in genetic appearance to the Aztecs?
Very similar, we would say, in genetic appearance to the Aztecs.
Now, the Aztecs worshipped the god Quetzalcoatl, which also was a feathered serpent. Now, was this an entirely different feathered serpent, dragon type of god, or is it the same one as Kukulkhan?
Same manifestation of the god previously, taking on a different form.
And did Kukulkhan continue into the Aztec civilization in some physical form, or was this also an astral interaction?
Well, remember, this is a hybrid being who is capable of shape-shifting. And so there were many times when the Aztec collective were interacting as one in a physical way with this being, while other times leaders of the tribe or councils, for example, were taking ceremonial astral journeys in order to interact.
Now, it seems to be, this is more prevalent, it appears, although we don't have a lot of records of the Mayans and Aztecs, but that the Aztecs participated in various sacrificial rituals of human beings among their tribes to their gods. What was that? Was that the same as we're referring to earlier? That the gods thrived on this energy from not necessarily sacrifice itself, but the act of committing your energy as an entire race of beings that the Aztecs were to that particular god.
It is always the energy, and it is assumed that the sacrifice is being made of one person, yet the greatest sacrifice is being made by all of those who participate in the ceremony. So it is a massive and collective energy that is being siphoned.
Another interesting thing I find is from an architectural standpoint, a lot of these sacrifices were held on the tops of pyramid structures that had a small building or room at the top that looks very similar to what I see depicted in biblical texts as a tabernacle building where there's a fire and smoke coming out of it. What's the significance of that?
Well, it is the dispersion of the energy, we might say, that is the most important consideration here, because the choice of the location was primary, and even the time or the period of season was also considered, because if energies were ripe to expand, the acts of those, or the energy of the acts of those that were sacrificing, they would go well beyond the receipt of the god that the sacrifice was being made for. In fact, it may create a ripple effect throughout the collective of more manifestations of density, or even more sacrifice, in other words. So think of this as a method of channeling the energy in a more efficient and collective sense, whether it's done via the vibrations coming through the inner earth and into the chamber in which the sacrifice is being made, or in conjunction with elevated vibrations of certain star alignments.
In any way, was the ancient god Dagon, was that a reptilian being or a dragon being of some sort?
Hybrid reptilian, yes.
And there's some potential connection between Dagon and what became the Catholic religion today. Is that connection true? Does Catholicism spring from a Dagonism religion?
The Dagonism religion is the origins of some of the Catholic teachings, but not all. So we really want to go back to that period and talk about where the focus truly was, because not unlike many of the stories we have been accounting to, where a certain god is being prayed to or a sacrifice is being made, this was the premise of these teachings. But it was done more through the religious programming or dogma of collective process, not necessarily a physical sacrifice alone, because what some began to realize is that the sacrifice was causing so much alarm that it had to be done more judiciously, or in other words, in a subconscious type of way. So beyond the Catholic religion, we actually see other religions springing off in similar types of forms or concepts, where the very idea of sacrifice or channeling energy to a god beyond the self is limiting the creative potential of the masses.
There are many indigenous tribes that still exist today who tell stories of their ancestors having interacted with Dagon, and that Dagon was a teacher and a benevolent leader of some sort. Is that true, that Dagon was sort of a teacher role and maybe also had some malevolent tendencies, as you early stated?
Well, much like many of the human beings on planet Earth looked up to the Anunnaki for their knowledge, and they may have been seen as benevolent beings in the teachings they were bestowing, reptilians were seen very much in the same light, because they were bringing such incredible concepts to the people that had never been heard before. Remember, especially in the vibrational or non-physical energetic modalities, whether that be healing or breath work. And because of this, these gods were trusted and seen as benevolent. And we are not making so much the distinction here between one or another. As we know, ultimately there could be some good intent here, where the ego begins to believe that what it is doing is for the benefit of those that it is teaching, when in fact it is actually only benefiting itself. So the idea of malevolence, it is somewhat subjective to the one who is being malevolent, because the intention behind it may seem very pure and maybe a motivating factor in its purpose, when in fact it is not actually doing good at all.
So along those lines then, if Dagon and Dagonism as a religion was the predecessor of Catholicism, modern-day Catholicism, are the gods of the Catholic religion from ancient times reptilian then?
In general, yes, but in not all circumstances, because you are looking at the origins of the Catholic religion only coming through one individual, group of individuals, or timeline, when in fact it spans many, and it has become what it is today through the blending and melding of many different historic accounts of what it once was.
Now, when I read biblical texts about things that happened in ancient times, I know the Bible has been altered and modified for various reasons throughout history, but a common thing that I find very hard to understand is the biblical God. Now, we've spoken many times about how the one true God is the God within, and but in various spiritual and religious texts on the planet, whether it be Allah or whether it be Quetzalcoatl, for example, we always see gods who want to be they obviously are not the God within, because they often, or in almost every case, want to be worshipped. They want to be followed. They are jealous gods, or they are fierce gods, or even gods who are very aggressive and even destroy entire communities of people when they don't get what they want. And the biblical one true God is Yahweh. And Yahweh, from my readings of the various depictions of Yahweh, appears to be a very fierce, not benevolent God, benevolent to his people who follow and worship him, but not benevolent in a general sense. And from the various descriptions, it appears to me to be a reptilian God. Is Yahweh a reptilian God?
It is a hybrid reptilian God, and we've been alluding to this hybrid nature for this entire transmission, because Remember, the original ones came and hybridized and evolved into many of the gods that you are speaking of today. The point that we want to make is that anytime prime creator or the universal God that exists within every individual is given an identity, its frequency becomes diminished, meaning those that are reaching for its power are forever looking outside of themselves in order to channel it, when in fact, it is always present within every individual to the degree it is understood and realized as the self. So across the board, any time that you are contemplating a religion that has identified and named a god that appears jealous or angry or vengeful, what you are seeing is manipulation, because that is a siphoning of life force and energetic currency through fear. And that fear is something that reptilians and many other beings that do not have humanity's best interest in mind are attempting to constantly expand.
So can we make a generalization then that YAHWEH was not a benevolent God, but was a hybrid, more malevolent God then? Although he did do some good things.
Well, what we can assume is that this God was of a reptilian consciousness. And that is another point that we should make, because you are assuming each individual has an identity and must be connected to a cosmic race, when in fact, what has been going on throughout history is the integration of a reptilian consciousness within the minds of humanity and within those who are in power. And that consciousness is creating stories and protocols and procedures that you must follow that are designed to diminish your connection to what we call God, which is actually universe running through you in all forms.
This God also demanded sacrifices as well be made to him. So this is a similar scenario to the other gods we've discussed so far today. Is that correct?
It is correct, yes.
Now, we'll come back to this idea in future conversations in more detail. But in the biblical stories, as well as the Annunaki stories, at the time of the Great Flood, it appears that, as we discussed in previous conversations, Enlil and the Anunnaki group, in a manner of speaking, partly through their actions and partly due to this nuclear event that occurred on Nibiru, initiated the Great Flood. And in the biblical as well as Anunnaki storylines, there is another god that is speaking to Noah or Utnapishtim, depending on the storyline, who helped that individual and his family survive the flood. And that appeared to be a different god who did not want to cause the destruction of the earth. And in the biblical text, that god is referred to as YAHWEH. So is this true that the God who worked with Noah to save him from the flood was in some ways in opposition to the Anunnaki race of beings?
Yes, it is true. But remember, many of these biblical accounts have been completely rewritten in order to confuse humanity. So while certainly we can confirm reptilian interference in this idea of mass destruction or chaos, we don't necessarily want to place the name YAHWEH in direct relationship to this message.
So the biblical reference of YAHWEH is referring to reptilians in general? Is that what you mean?
We believe it's referring to a collective consciousness.
Okay. Of reptilians.
Yes. Hybrid reptilians.
So the Anunnaki wanted to destroy the civil or life on Earth, in a manner of speaking, the Nephilim and human beings included, but the reptilians didn't want that.
Well, they did not want the destruction of Earth because it would have destroyed their own collective. It would not only have had ramifications for the human beings and the plant and animal life, but it would have also destroyed their own race.
So what's the advantage to them to saving human beings then specifically? Because either way the flood happened, right? So they didn't stop the flood, they just simply managed to save Noah and human beings.
Well, because the most precious asset at your disposal as human beings is your multidimensional DNA. And that is what they are attempting to preserve, because without it, there is no ability for the reptilians to tap into an energy that, on behalf of human beings, allowed them to thrive.
Meaning if there are fewer human beings on the planet, reptilians don't have as much energy to thrive.
That is one interpretation. But remember, at the very beginning of time and the seeding of humanity by intergalactics, reptilians contributed their own DNA. And a race that finds themselves in jeopardy due to any cataclysm is going to rely upon the DNA of another in order to receive their own codes, history, and memories.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're sort of saying in my simplistic form that reptilians, because they were part of the original seeding of the humanity, that they have a vested interest in humanity existing on the planet, in a manner of speaking, even though at the same time not interfering, but our existence is also a problem for them at the same time. Whereas the Anunnaki did not have that vested interest because they were not part of the original seeding. Is that what you mean?
Well, perhaps we can phrase it this way. In a very unconscious state, what has happened over a great many number of years is that humans have become hybridized with reptilians, and the reptilian race now lives on through humanity.
But weren't we also modified by the Anunnaki? So how's that different?
It is no different. It is perhaps the war or the race that you are referring to right now, because within the human genome, both of these collectives have precious energy and information to siphon. And both of them focused upon their own preservation on a planet where human DNA is the most valuable to, we'll say, intersect with, is going to create some discordance.
Okay, well, we're going to finish up there for today. Thank you, Micheila. Mm-hmm. And we'll pick up next time with our conversation that we've started, and maybe continue down this topic as well and integrate that into everything else we've discussed in previous conversations. So thank you all for joining us for Channel Revelations today. You can also find us on various podcast platforms, also on Rumble as well if you'd like. And we'll see you next week for another Awake and Empowered podcast.